I want you to think for a minute about Sigmund Freud and tell me what words come to mind. Therapy, couch, cigar, pervert. Let's face it, a quick Google search will turn up plenty of critics about Freud's work, and just as many jokes as people home in on some of the antiquated or narrowly focused parts of his work. But Britannica calls him the founder of psychoanalysis, and American sociologist Philip Rieff credits his vision with being responsible for psychological man replacing earlier notions of political, religious or economic man as the 20th century's dominant self-image. To ignore Freud's contribution is probably like throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So where do all these jokes and criticisms come from, and do we need to take a chill pill and just leave Freud alone? Let's go back to where it all took place, 19th century Austria. Freud's theories emerged from Austro-Hungarian Empire in a time when, as Pickman notes on page 6, all Christian churches taught that sex was to take place within marriage in order to produce children, not simply for pleasure. Even in Austria, where Christianity was first introduced by the Roman Empire, SBS Cultural Atlas tells us Freud's theories were particularly controversial for their emphasis on sexuality, because of taboo around the subject at the time, and critics seem to have become fixated on the sexual aspects of Freud's theory ever since. But let's take a step back and look at his broader concepts before busting out the cigars. There are 3 stages to Freud's psychoanalytic theory: trauma, also known as seduction theory, topographic theory, and structural theory. Let's zoom in on topographic theory, and this is where Freud defined the model of the conscious, preconscious, and unconscious mind. The conscious realm is what we're aware of. Beneath that lies the preconscious, where the ego, gatekeeper of memories, lives with our accessible memories. Beneath that again is the unconscious, where the id, our instincts, and superego, our morals, dwell with our hidden memories. In Freud's theory, id is made up of 2 parts. Eros, life instinct responsible for things like breathing, eating and sex. The energy created by the life instinct is known as libido, so it's not just about sex. The other part of the id is thanatos, the death instinct representing the destructive forces inside us that turn up as aggression and violence. According to MacLeod's article on Simply Psychology, Eros is more powerful than thanatos, which is why we tend to survive, not self-destruct. Now, it's through Freud's early exploration into bodily hysterical phenomena and the case of Joseph Breuer's patient Bertha Pappenheim, aka Anna O, that he really started to flesh out his ideas. In this study of trauma, the men developed the concepts of repression and dissociation as defences against trauma. And as noted on Mansager and Beaumont's article on page 8, Jordan and Jordan, Freud insisted Pappenheim's symptoms were rooted in suppressed childhood abuse, which led him and Breuer to part ways, but Freud went on to develop talk therapy and free association as a result of this study. From their findings, Freud and Breuer concluded that the one thing that motivates us is our tendency to seek pleasure and avoid pain. They called this the pleasure principle. The developmental experience of the pleasure principle is what sparks the reality principle, and this shapes psychological structure. Freud speculated that as infants we need to integrate social values through social structures like family, and this is where individuals' wants and needs come into conflict with what our parents and society expect. Freud developed his tools of free association and talk therapy with the goal of making the unconscious conscious, because that's ultimately where we can process our conflicts and resolve them. And this is where we start to see some of the theories unfold that people really start to scratch their heads at today. Freud's psychosexual theory, which is outlined in pages 10 to 13 of Jordan and Jordan, says there's a sequence of psychological development that unfolds during our early years. Just like any good video game, we get to level up, and depending on what we resolve or collect on the way, we end up with certain personality traits. The levels correspond with chronological life stages. From birth to 18 months, it's all about oral gratification, where sexual desire is centered around the mouth. Put simply, in its drive for pleasure, all new humans will seek out something to suckle on. The 2 levels in this phase are passive, where instinctual oral gratification is achieved, progressing to the oral aggressive stage where they actively seek objects to satisfy their needs. A fixation at this stage would indicate a tendency to rely on primitive defences when up against life's frustrations. Time to level up, and for the next 18 months until we turn 3, we explore the anal stage. Hello anal pleasure and the resulting conflict with society's attitudes towards that. This is where we learn to control our bowel movements under the guidance of our parents. In a broader context of society, Freud sees this as when we learn the right time to hold and when to release. So while it might feel good to get that immediate release, society steps in and says, hang on buddy, we're trying to eat here, or something to that effect. And being stuck in this phase looks like power struggles, and not just interpersonal, but sometimes on the inside, like conflicts between stinginess and overgenerosity, for example. It's in this anal stage where we would develop particular defences. Reaction formation, where we experience the opposite of what we want. Undoing, which is where we learn to say, just fill my duds, sorry about that. Isolation, which is like dissociation, where the act of release becomes mechanical and detached from emotion. And intellectualization, where we can rationalise our experience but still struggle with it. Whew, got through that okay? Time to level up to Freud's phallic stage. I know, ladies in the room be like, pfft. But Freud assures us everyone goes through this. This is where we take great interest in our genitalia and also become curious about the opposite sex. Conflict in this stage is well documented and lampooned in the Oedipal conflict, where the object of the child's sexual desires often, but not always, homes in on mum. I mean, I love my mum, but clearly my castration anxiety kicked in, which is the point at which the son represses his desires for mum, as well as his rivalrous behaviour towards dad, towing the line with his rules to avoid castration. Ever met someone who was overly proud, flirtatious or brash? That could indicate they're stuck at the phallic level of this game we call human development. They've been overindulged. Over-rejection, on the other hand, might manifest in that dowdy-looking friend who comes across as shy or bashful. According to Freud, the risk of incest is always present, and it's only through repression and hard-working unconscious we battle this taboo and avoid castration. That was hard work. And congratulations for completing the phallic level. It's time for a wee rest, and let's head for the latency stage. This is where we can hit the pause button and bask in the success of pregenital personality formation. By the time we turn 6, all of our pregenital desires are repressed and there's nothing more to see here. But you know there's a storm brewing. And you heard me mention another phase I haven't covered yet, and that's the genital phase. When adolescence hits, Freud's theory marks this as the return of the libido, and this time it's focused on the genital region. This is when we find objects for sex in our expressions of love and a focus for our aggression in our work. To progress here, Freud said there'd first need to be a conflict between our instinctual desires and the way society restrains us both in our minds and in the physical world. The fixations we picked up in the other levels now show up as personality traits. Looking past psychosexual behaviour, the idea of the nuclear family comes into the picture as we start to think more analytically. This works on the assumption there is a nurturing mum and a protective dad in every family, and that our needs evolve from a fundamental need for human attachment, as noted on page 13 of Jordan and Jordan. Our motivation to constantly seek gratification of sexual and aggressive impulses is what drives us, and there are plenty of obstacles along the way. Society's rules and family expectations, for example. Our mission is to overcome our internal psychic conflicts where we develop defence mechanisms and make sure we get what we need in a way that avoids or minimises guilt and anxiety. Okay, so I've had some fun looking at some of Freud's basic theories, and as a counsellor, I'd be reluctant to home in on specifics around psychosexual determinants as they've been defined here. Where I do see value in Freud's work is in the goal to make the unconscious conscious, and even to help the client to revisit times from their early life to help unlock persistent and unwanted patterns of behaviour. I see Freud's talk therapy as useful, and the process of free association where the client is encouraged to blurt out any old thing in relation to a word or concept that might give us breadcrumbs to the bigger picture below the surface. Think back to the start of this presentation for an example. Concluding that clients' love for muscle cars is a sign they're stuck in the phallic stage and somehow linked to an incestuous desire for their mum? Not so much, in regards to both client complexity and counsellor personal safety. Other cracks appear when we look at Freud from a modern-day multicultural perspective. Even though the Oedipal phase has been rebadged as the Electra complex when referring to girls, turning their affections from mum to dad, having realised they don't have a penis themselves, as per Cherry's overview of the complex on the Very Well Mind website, it still reflects a dominance of male thinking where the female perspective is viewed through a patriarchal lens. In their investigation into whether the male-dominated psychoanalytic approach fails the needs of women in a research context, Masley and Associates yielded some paradoxical results. Psychoanalytic theory does more accurately predict male behaviour when participant groups are mixed gender, but it works equally well for either gender when the study's participants are limited to one gender only, suggesting Freud's theory sticks when a study is able to explore more gender-specific questions. Next, psychoanalysis comes from an individualist perspective. Freud's approach and goals focus on individual identity, but not all cultures are individualistic. Another quick Google search will unearth many more collectivist cultures where family and workgroup goals are valued above individual goals. As Australian society becomes more rich and complex, with more people from collectivist cultures settling here, therapists need to consider this as we enter the therapy room with our Western European individualist values. Amongst Freud's critics is his own granddaughter, Sophie Freud, who debunks her grandfather's theories in English's Toronto Star article, where the Professor Emeritus of Social Work says of psychoanalysis, "I think it's such a narcissistic indulgence that I cannot believe in it." There are still people carrying the torch for Dr. Freud, though, as modern theories continue to develop, inspired by his foundational work. Neuropsychologist and psychoanalyst Mark Solms is described in Kaiser's Washington Post article as saying, "We should take Freud's theory into account when paying attention to what he describes as the deeply knotted core of the brainstem. This, he says, is where consciousness arises, and it's the place where our emotions, pleasures and desires live. He asserts that our feelings seep through into our conscious experience because at the physiological level, the sources of each of these cognitive functions are deeply entangled." So, as with anything, whether you agree with all of Freud's assertions or not, there are some nuggets to be found in some of his work, and it's these we can confidently add to our toolkit as we approach each new client with fresh eyes and fresh ears.